Participate. I better be quick. If we fail to resolve this issue now, it will simply plunge us into another manufactured crisis, which will quickly undermine the stability and confidence that some believe this agreement is bringing. The fact that this agreement deals temporarily with preventing a cut in Medicare's physician reimbursement rate is welcome. But as with our fiscal sustainability, it needs to be dealt with on a permanent basis. I'm pleased that the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee today marked up legislation to do so. However, it is unconscionable that the budget deal before us today does not extend unemployment insurance, which help those who are most at risk in our society, and if we do not help them, the economy will suffer and 200,000 jobs are predicted to be lost. On December 28th, 1.3 million Americans will lose their unemployment insurance if we do not act, and they will be joined by an additional 3.5 million Americans in 2014. The House should not leave town without ensuring that individuals looking for work have the safety net of unemployment insurance. Finally, Mr. Speaker, have you got an additional minute?
30. Can I do 30 seconds, Mr. Hart?
Gentleman's recognized for...
Finally, I'm disappointed this budget deal turns once again to middle-class workers. I'll submit the balance of my statement. Let me close with this. This agreement is better than the alternative, but it misses a huge opportunity to do what the American people expect us to do, and that is put this country on a fiscally sustainable path. And I would urge my friend from Wisconsin, and I have urged my friend from Maryland, my colleague, summon up the courage, much of which you've already shown, to help us put this country on a fiscally sustainable path, and yes, make tough decisions. And I will join with the gentleman from Wisconsin and the gentleman from Maryland in helping us to get the votes for those tough decisions that are necessary. But it needs to be a balanced deal. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
No more speakers, and I reserve the right to close, so...
Got 1 minute. Okay. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, a great member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to thank the gentleman very much for his kindness in yielding. As I indicated earlier today, that even the Time magazine recognized that the better of all of us is when we extend ourselves to the most vulnerable, acknowledging Pope Francis. And so I want to ask the chairman of the Budget Committee, because he's heard so many of us indicate that there is value to this budget deal. Chairman Ryan, I'd like to pose a question, if I could, to you, if you would. You've heard us say that we, too, appreciate the bipartisanship. I disagree with so much of it in terms of the sequester and what has been done as it relates to nutrition for the unemployed. But would you not hold us back? Would you not join us in putting on the floor an amendment that would provide for the extension of unemployment that will not run out December 28th for the hardworking Americans, 68,000 in Texas, 1.3 million? Would you not do that?
I'll defer to the Speaker's comments.
Well, we get no answer, and all I can say is that this budget is a deal that I want to thank Mr. Van Hollen for the work that has been done, along with the other conferees, Ms. Lowy, Mr. Clyburn, but I believe we should not leave here today, leave here this week, without having a freestanding, and I wish the gentleman would own up to honesty and answer the question, but to be able to put on the floor of the House the opportunity for those who have worked to be able to get unemployment insurance, not a handout, but unemployment insurance. I know, Mr. Ryan, that we can carry our bipartisanship at least to that point and be able to work on behalf of the American people, carrying forward the need to ensure that we have housing, education, child care, all of that. A little bit is happening under this particular budget. That's why many of us are interested in moving forward, getting rid of the sequester, keeping the doors open. But I would think that there's enough bipartisanship on both sides of the aisles to be able to extend the unemployment insurance, and we should not leave here. I ask the President to convene us, to call the Senate, call the House, and make sure that we vote on that. I thank the gentleman for the hard work that you have engaged in and also how far you have brought us. With that, I yield back.
How much time is he?
I thought I yielded a minute.
The gentleman from Maryland has 1 minute remaining.
Is the gentleman prepared to close? Okay.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Hoyer's right. This agreement does not address the comprehensive issues that we need to address. We need to address those in a balanced way, and that means working on both additional smart, targeted spending cuts, but also closing special interest tax breaks. But what this agreement does do is make sure that in the next several weeks we do not move to a full sequester, very deep across-the-board cuts, which will hurt the economy. Instead, it provides more room to invest in vital areas like education and research. That is a positive note. That is a positive bipartisan note. I do want to say, Mr. Speaker, however, and this is not as a result of anything the chairman of the Budget Committee does, there is also a sour note in leaving here without having addressed the unemployment insurance. This agreement didn't include the doc fix, and it didn't include unemployment insurance. We should be dealing with both those issues together. We're only dealing with one of them now. So I hope as we go forward we will address those issues, and we should not leave town until we address the unemployment issue. But let's at the same time take this small, positive step forward. I thank the Speaker.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin. Gentleman, Wisconsin has 5.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, there are many reasons why I encourage my colleagues to support this bipartisan budget agreement. Number one, by doing this, we reduce the deficit by $23 billion. If we don't do this, we don't reduce the deficit by $23 billion. That means we're reducing it versus doing nothing. A step in the right direction. A move toward fiscal responsibility. Not near as far as we want to go, but at least going in the direction we want to go. The budget we passed here in the House, just like the prior two budgets that we passed here in the House, represents the full extent of our ambition, our vision, and our goals. It balances the budget within 10 years. It reforms the tax code without raising taxes. It reforms our entitlement programs that were vital and were made in the 20th century so that they work for the 21st century. It pays off our debt so that we do not leave our children a nation of debt. That's our goal. That's our vision. That's our destiny. With the bipartisan budget agreement, we couldn't accomplish that because we have different opinions. We have different objectives. That's why we worked for common ground. That's why we took our budget, all the different budgets that were offered, we laid them on top of each other, and we looked for common ground. We went through the federal budget program by program, line by line. We discussed and debated these things, and we saw where is it can we agree needs reforming. Where is it that we agree taxpayer money is being wasted? Where is it we agree that cronyism and corporate welfare should go away? Where is it we agree that some reform for autopilot mandatory spending ought to occur? And where we found that agreement, we put it in this agreement. That's the way it's supposed to work. So we see this as a step in the right direction on the way toward fulfilling our ultimate goal. Second thing we accomplished that's very important to us, and Mr. Van Hollen kind of mentioned it, this does not raise taxes. Hardworking taxpayers have worked hard and long enough that we need to work on spending instead of taking more from them. Third thing, we're taking permanent spending cuts to pay for temporary sequester relief. We think that's a good idea. The savings clearly take time to accrue in this agreement, and that's because we're changing permanent law, and those permanent law changes that are made by this act start accruing and compounding that savings so that the savings keep growing and compounding on and on and on. The funny thing about autopilot spending, about what we call mandatory spending, is it compounds away from you and spends so much more, but if you get reforms, if you get savings, those savings compound as well. This does that. permanent spending cuts to pay for some temporary sequester relief. Now, what is the sequester? It's across the board, it's crude, it doesn't prioritize, it doesn't give Congress any say-so on how money is being spent. That's the third thing that this does that I think is pretty good. In addition to keeping 92% of the sequester intact, what this bill does is it says Congress ought to decide how money is being spent, not the administration. So instead of deferring and delegating our power to the executive branch with continuing resolution after continuing resolution, we, Republicans and Democrats, the legislative branch, are bringing that power back to Congress so that the people's house, so that the legislature, as the founders in the Constitution intend, we decide how that money is being spent. We decide how to prioritize spending. That's our job. I also like the precedent that this sets. We know we are always going to have fiscal pressure because the sequester, as they mentioned, has not been lifted. It's still here. So it's always going to produce pressure. And I like the precedent that we're sending here. The precedent that we're starting here is we're not going back to the taxpayer. We're not going to ask more from hardworking taxpayers. We're going to ask the government to do with less. And as we transfer permanent spending cuts for temporary relief, we're going to have more spending cuts than we give back in relief, so we reduce the deficit further. $85 billion in mandatory savings to pay for $63 billion in sequester relief. That's a pretty good precedent. I'd like to add one or two more zeros at the end of these numbers, but I'll take the direction we have right now. The other point is this. We've been at each other's throats for a long time. Look, I was part of the last presidential election. We tried defeating this president. I wish we would have. Elections have consequences, Mr. Speaker. And I fundamentally believe, this is just my personal opinion, I know it's a slightly partisan thing to say, to really do what we think needs to be done, we're going to have to win some elections. And in the meantime, let's try and make this divided government work. I think our constituents are expecting a little more from us. They're expecting us to not keep shutting the government down. They're expecting us to pay the bills. They're expecting us to be accountable. They're expecting us to watch how their dollars are being spent. And they're expecting us to find common ground. And that's what this does. And that is why I urge all of my colleagues to support this. And I give back the balance of my time.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The time allotted to the Committee on the Budget has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, will each control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, every year for the last decade, doctors have faced an ever-increasing cut to their reimbursement under the Sustainable Growth Rate, or SGR. And every year, Congress intervenes with a doc fix to stop the cut from going into effect, 15 times since 2003. The Pathway for SGR Reform Act will postpone the cut, providing a 0.5% update to physicians for the next 3 months. While this is a necessary and important bill, I'm disappointed that legislation to permanently repeal the flawed SGR formula will not be considered before the end of the year. Doctors deserve to know that they will be fairly compensated, and this annual uncertainty about reimbursements could lead to access problems for Medicare beneficiaries. The Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee worked for 2 years and produced a bipartisan bill that successfully moved through the full committee with unanimous support. I regret that this bill is not on the floor today. However, I urge all of my colleagues to support H.J. Res. 59 to prevent this devastating cut from going into effect on January 1. Thank you, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
I want to express my disappointment that we are letting unemployed insurance be denied for so many long-term unemployed especially a few days right after Christmas. We should not leave town until we have fixed this problem. I'm going to vote for this budget because it will ease the irrational sequestration cuts that have already done so much harm to our country and our economy. That's the main reason that I'm going to be an aye vote on it. But I'm here to speak on behalf of the Energy and Commerce Committee Democrats to express my strong support for the temporary reprieve from the what's called SGR cuts, the cuts to physicians who see Medicare patients. Congress is making enormous strides toward repeal and replacement of the flawed Medicare physician payment system. But more time is going to be needed to finish the job. As of today, all three congressional committees of jurisdiction have marked up historic bipartisan legislation that moves the system to one that rewards value of care rather than the volume of care. This short-term extension that is part of this bill will allow for 3 months for Congress to complete floor and conference action on this legislation. We need to keep this process moving full steam ahead to get a permanent solution on both the SGR as well as the other Medicare and Medicaid extenders as quickly as possible. This temporary patch will allow us the time to continue that work. I do have serious concerns with both the Medicare and Medicaid policies in the Budget Act. The Medicaid provisions will result in delayed payments to providers for 3 months while states seek out payment from other potential sources. This is simply bad policy. Congress would not dream of allowing Medicare to avoid paying for services for 3 months. Yet this is the policy that we are going to adopt for Medicaid. The other Medicaid provision overturns a Supreme Court case which would allow a state to take a beneficiary's liability settlement that is intended to compensate for lost wages or future medical costs to pay for Medicaid services. Indeed, the language as drafted suggests that the state could collect amounts even in excess of the amount the party was liable for. This provision is unconscionable, and I hope we come back, we can fix it. Further, the extension of the sequester on Medicare. We're relieving the sequester on the defense side and the domestic spending side under appropriations, but we're leaving in place a sequestration of Medicare, which means continuing cuts into the future without any policy rationale. We're talking about cuts to doctors and hospitals and other providers. There's no justification for it. And in addition, there are cuts that are going to be applied by continuing this part of the sequestration to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services of much-needed resources to carry out their many responsibilities. This is not a good way to make law and will result in some unfortunate consequences. We need to fix that again when we get back next year. But I express my support for this short-term extension of not just SGR, but also the other expiring Medicare and Medicaid provisions, including the TMA and QI, which are critical for low-income populations. And I look forward to addressing the issues of SGR and the extenders with our colleagues over the next few months to develop a permanent solution. And with that, Mr. Chairman, if I have any time left, I will withhold the balance of my time.
The gentleman has some time, and he reserves his time. I advise the gentleman he has 30 seconds when his time comes again. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Upton.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman of the Health Subcommittee for the time. You know, it's important that seniors don't find a lump of coal in their stocking for Christmas, and this fully offset package represents access to health care for about 40 million seniors. It's going to give seniors the peace of mind of knowing that their trusted physician will be there when they need them most by securing stable payments for physicians. Since its passage back in 1997, SGR has bred uncertainty and frustration. This uncertainty has left seniors in the lurch, wondering if their doctors would be able to remain in practice and available for checkups and consultation, and this is no way to keep Americans healthy or run a health care system. So members on both sides of the aisle agree that the SGR is broken. Earlier this year, our committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, myself with Mr. Waxman, we voted 51-0 on H.R. 2810, which would permanently repeal SGR and replace it with a system that promotes the highest quality of care. While I'm disappointed that we didn't repeal SGR permanently this year, this agreement, tonight, is a step forward where we're going to continue to work at a more complete solution. The fix is fully offset, something that full reform will also need to accomplish. I look forward to working with my colleagues on all the committees to get it done in a bipartisan way. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, as a supporter of the Affordable Care Act, I look forward to next year when we will see all Americans have a chance to buy health insurance. For those who are on Medicare, that is their health insurance coverage, and we will only keep the promise for coverage to them if we pay the providers who give them care, especially the physicians. And that's why I ask for an aye vote on this bill.
Okay. Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Subcommittee Chairman Kevin Brady.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, first let me thank Chairman Pitts for his leadership of the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce and toward a solution for our local physicians. I rise today in support of the Pathway for SGR Reform Act. This is an important bill because it makes sure that our local physicians who treat our seniors don't face a drastic cut in their reimbursements on New Year's Day. We need a permanent solution, and just this morning the Ways and Means Committee unanimously voted to advance a bill that begins the process of a permanent, reliable solution so our seniors can continue to see a local doctor when they need them. It is not easy to bridge the gap and pay for this legislation, but until we can complete the right solution, we had to make some difficult.
To be heard. The gentleman from Texas will suspend. The House will be in order. House will be in order. Gentleman from Texas, recognized.
To bridge the gap until we can complete the process of a permanent solution, we had to make some difficult choices. In particular, I want to thank long-term care hospitals for their strong leadership. We were able to work with this industry to design new criteria that create efficiencies to generate savings in the important Medicare program. Without the strong support of leaders in the LTAC industry, this would not have been possible, and this has helped make a good bill even better. It deserves our support, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, member of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Griffith.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. The gentleman will suspend. The House will be in order. I'd ask members and others to take their conversations off the floor. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time. I rise in support of this 3-month SGR patch, as it is important to ensure that seniors will still be able to see a doctor after January 1 if they are sick. I am firmly committed to finally repealing and replacing the SGR, and I fully support the bipartisan bill we advanced unanimously out of the Energy and Commerce Committee for this purpose. Our next step is to find a common House position with our friends on Ways and Means to finally say goodbye to the SGR. Most importantly, I'm glad to see that this deal extends the Medicare-dependent hospital and low-volume programs, which are critical for my rural hospitals in southwest Virginia. If these programs were not extended, Virginia hospitals in total would lose more than $10 million in Medicare reimbursements next year, at a time when they are already being hit hard by new costs and deep cuts from Obamacare. At least 8 hospitals in my district benefit from these 2 essential programs that keep the doors open in some economically distressed areas and provide health care access to rural constituents. For that reason, I am proud to support this legislation and stand up for rural health care and our seniors.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire of the time remaining on each side?
The gentleman from Pennsylvania has 1 minute. The gentleman from California's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this is very important bipartisan legislation. It includes the 3-month bridge for the SGR, where we can continue to work in a bipartisan manner to come up with the final version of repeal for the sustainable growth rate. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 438, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the motion offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Recorded
The
vote.
gentleman from Pennsylvania, recorded vote is requested. Those in favor of recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having done so, recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and adopt House Resolution 441. This is a 15-minute vote.
So the House moving on now to a final passage vote on the 2-year federal budget agreement. That deal hammered out by Republican House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan and Democratic Senate Budget Committee Chair Patty Murray several days ago. It raises overall spending, federal spending over the next 2 years by reducing some of the sequester cuts, but it also cuts other mandatory programs and raises some federal fees, including one on airplane tickets and other travel fees. The measure also blocks an upcoming cut in Medicare payments to doctors and increases their reimbursement by 0.5% through March. The House moving quickly through a number of remaining pieces of legislation this afternoon. The House moved up action on the Farm Bill extension today, approving it earlier on a voice vote. And still to come, you may have heard another vote after this 15-minute vote, a 5-minute vote on the Defense Authorization Bill. Tomorrow, the House will be in at 11 a.m. for a pro forma session. No votes are scheduled in the House tomorrow. We'll continue to watch the vote tally as the vote continues on the 2014 budget agreement. Our live coverage here on C-SPAN.
On this vote, the ayes are 332, the noes are 94. The motion is agreed to, is adopted, and without objection, the motion laid on the table. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members will please take their seats. The House will be in order. Members will please take their seats. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask you to address the House for one moment, please.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask my colleagues to join me as we pause to honor and remember the life of former South African President Nelson Mandela, who dedicated his life to making his vision of a free South Africa a reality. Mr. Mandela stood for peace, for justice, and for a society that recognized the equality of every human being. After serving 27 years in prison for challenging the apartheid-sanctioned South African government, Nelson Mandela emerged with a powerful message of forgiveness and reconciliation, a message that would transform his nation and unite the world. In 1986, the members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the majority of the U.S. Congress stood with Mandela for peace and justice and helped force an end to apartheid in South Africa. Today, I leave you with Nelson Mandela's words, and I quote, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead." South Africa and the world will forever be changed because Nelson Mandela lived. I now ask that you pause for a moment of silence in honor of a great man, a man we respectfully and affectionately refer to as Madiba.
The members will rise and observe a moment of silence. Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon, to suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 441, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 441, resolution providing for the concurrence by the House and the Senate amendments to H.R. 3304 with an amendment.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to the resolution? Members will vote by electronic device. It's a 5-minute vote.
So after overwhelmingly passing the federal budget agreement, the vast majority of Republicans and Democrats voting in favor of the budget deal, we move on to a vote now on the defense authorization bill. It includes a 1% military pay increase, permission to continue war efforts in Afghanistan, and military weapons programs. It bars funds for future military base closings and transfer of detainees from Guantanamo Bay to the U.S., but does allow some transfers to other countries. This is a 5-minute vote, the defense authorization bill being taken up under suspension of the rules today. The House moved rather quickly through a number of remaining pieces of legislation this afternoon, taking care of the Farm Bill extension that was approved earlier today on a voice vote, as were a couple of other suspension bills. Still ahead, the House will be in session tomorrow at 11 o'clock, but it's a pro forma session, and no more votes are expected either tonight or tomorrow in the House. Meanwhile, over in the Senate, senators have been in a marathon session, continuously in session since 2 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, working on a series of nominations. Republicans in the Senate have insisted on using all the debate time allotted to them for the nominations. The Senate may be in session again all night tonight, and our live coverage, of course, will continue on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Here it's the Defense Programs and Policy Bill. A 5-minute vote continues. Live coverage of the House on C-SPAN.
On this vote, the yeas are 349, the nays are 69, two-thirds being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection.
Ms. Meehan.